the day has finally arrived, and I have pulled together my answers for the questions that I asked back in June when I asked for my followers to ask me questions related to wildfowl carving. So I did get 2 people who were brave enough to ask me some questions, and I'm going to address those. So I'm doing this on behalf of wildfowlcarvingstudio.com. It's a newer website that is all about wildfowl carving reference materials and how-tos, instructionals. It's a nice website, and we hope you go and visit it. So, Randy Nokes asks, do you have best practice methods in painting? And what are my favorite brushes? Well, what I've done for this entire Q&A is I created a PDF because a lot of times I've answered these questions in a separate video that's already up on YouTube. I might elaborate on some of those questions that are asked, but sometimes I already have those answers for you. So if I created a PDF, not only could I include photographs of my brushes, I could also include links to the various videos or products that I recommend. So let's move ahead. First, I'm going to address the question on my favorite brushes. I have a video on the YouTube channel talking about brushes and their uses, and I talk about everything about the brushes I use for wildfowl carving. This was a talk that I gave at the Minnesota Decoy and Wildfowl Carving Club back in 2018, shortly after the Old Squad Drake with the tail up article came out, which was very extensive in hand painting instruction, and it'd be a really good suggestion for you to look that painting issue up. I really defined the way I painted. It caused me to have to really take a look at how I actually achieve what I do when I paint. So that article is a good suggestion. So first of all, I will start with my list of favorite brushes. And the Isabey 6168 Kolinsky Sables, they're filbert shape. I like the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. And I can use them for oils or acrylics. They're great when they're brand new. As you can see here, the new ones are on the right, and the old ones, which have been worn down and are repurposed, have never been thrown away. They've just been assigned a new job. So this is my collection of the Isabey 6168s that I've had over the 37 years I've been carving and painting. And I have 2. These are 4s, 6s. I like the 8s. I really like the 10s because I got 5 of them. And then there's the 12s. Now, of course, the larger these brushes get, the more expensive they are. So it's important to learn how to take care of them. And but those are my favorite brushes for a few reasons. The reason I started liking these was B.B. Hopper, a famous carver who's no longer with us. She lent me some of these for a painting contest at the San Diego show, and I fell in love with them. I didn't realize how expensive they were, though, until I went to buy my own. And the number 12 can run anywhere from 60 to 90, even 120, depending upon the market. at the time. The 10, they slowly go down, so the 10 would go down to like 40 to 80, and the 8 would go down to, say, 30 to 50, and so on and so forth. So the smaller brushes are less expensive, but they are nice because they can lay out a feather pattern really quickly for you. The back edge of the shape of the brushes create a back shape of a feather in various sizes, and you can use that to quickly lay in feather patterns, starting from the back and moving to the front. B.B. Hopper was really, really good at it, and I listened to all of her tips, and it works really well, especially if you're working on decorative smoothies. So moving on, my second favorite brush is so important to have is the Raphael 8403 or 8408. In fact, I'm just going to quick double check on my number there. Oh, that's the Brene brush, which is basically the 8408. I believe the 8403 is maybe for watercolor. So I've got a little bit of a typo here, and that should say 8408. Anyway, I like the size 0s, 1, 2, and 3s. I mostly use the 0s and the 1s and the 2s. The thing that's so nice about these Kolinsky sables is their nice fine point, and the fact that they will hold a load of paint for a really long time. I mean, enough for you to paint for a really long time without having to go back to your palette. The other thing that's nice about them is how springy they are, which works out really well when you're using them for vermiculating. And another thing that's very nice about them is because of the natural fiber that is used for the bristles, it actually holds on to the paint in a different way than a synthetic or a nylon brush would, which is kind of a slippery surface. They have a natural tooth to each bristle, which holds onto the paint and delivers it in a way that I've not found in any other brushes like them. Another popular brush I use is the Royal Majestic Monogram, and these are tiny little brushes, and they come in sizes double-aught and triple-aught. That's 2 0s and 3 0s. They're only for acrylics. Then I have another one which is also Royal Majestic, and they're smaller filberts, but they will go, there's even a micro filbert, but there's a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. They also make really great feather patterns using them in a one-stroke process of painting. Then you're always going to need something to do the dirty work for your painting, for like sealing and for base coats, where you are using polyurethane and you're using not heavy, but several coats of blocked in paint. You don't need a fine brush for that. So those are hog hair and horsehair brushes that I use for applying sealer and base coats. I've got a link to a Dick Blick kind of brush, natural bristle brush that I would use. Now, this next photograph in the PDF are various brushes at various stages in their lifetimes. You can see here, this is it was probably a natural bristled bright, and if you look close you can see the different numbers. Sometimes these are still available, sometimes they are not. So I have some brights, and I have a round, and I use that for dots. It's round, so it works really good for loons. These are various slant tips that after they're used for a while, that pointier slant tip ends and becomes a straight. But these are great for blending, especially in oils. This is a real fine Lang nickel royal sable for doing vermiculations and the finest of fine down feather swirls. And here is the Raphaels that I've referred to. The Brunet, the Fabre, and the Brunet here, the 01 and the 2. They're all the same brush. They were branded for the Brunets and Kurt Fabre for Kurt's Waterfowl Corner. And Kurt actually gave these to me to try out, and that was my first experience with the Raphaels, and I never went back. Now these are newer Raphaels, and they're the 8408s. You can see how pointy they are here. These were as pointy as these on the right, but they were worn down with use and have different jobs now, like outlining feathers when I'm laying out feather groups and putting in dots and painting in areas that are better painted with a more blunt brush. This says Kurt's Waterfowl Corner here, and there's, I think, have 3 or 4 of these. They're kind of a blender brush, and you can still get those through James Company. So Randy had asked about my best practices, so I'm going to go through a list of several points, and we'll see how this works out. Okay, number 1, use good quality brushes appropriate for the task. You know, you don't use a Kolinsky sable to apply a base coat. You use a broader natural bristled brush to apply a base coat. So I've gone over some of the different uses I've used for blending or laying in detail. So you want to use the right brush that's appropriate for the task. Use fresh, number 2, use fresh paints and mediums. I've encountered near disaster results using old Grumbacher turpentine, and it was in the can. However, I've also had remainder left over from a project of Grumbacher turpentine in the newer clear bottles, which I always recommend now. It turned yellow within 9 months of opening it, so I had to throw it away. A rule of thumb for me is a new bottle of Grumbacher turpentine for each project when I'm painting in oils, unless they're back to back. Another disappointment has been when I've lost sight of how old my acrylic paints are and my mediums. I've started dating all of my paint bottles with a Sharpie, so I know they have a date on the side, but I also want to know when I bought them. So I also mark my mediums and my acrylic paints. I mark my oil mediums as well, and turpentines and lacquer thinners, just so I know how old they are. Time flies and much faster than we think, so you want to be sure and put some dates on those so you know exactly how old they are. The other thing is important, number 3, is to have enough of that product you want to use on hand. So if you don't know how much acrylic paint you have before you start painting, you could run out, and then you'd have to wait for it to arrive if you can get a hold of it. Sometimes you can't. So You want to make sure you have everything that you need before you get started. It's also important to check how old they are. If you haven't been dating your paints like I do, you'll want to check and see how old are they. Um, you can open up the bottle on, say, the Deco Art Traditions paint. You can take the cap off, and I use a shish kebab skewer. It's bamboo, but I can reach all the way down into the bottom of that bottle and see if there's solids in the bottom. If there are, forget it, throw it away. It'll never mix the way that it was when you bought it new, and you might as well start with new paints rather than trying to make old paint work. It's just hard enough to paint as it is for you to introduce more turmoil in having bad paint is not a good idea. When you're using tube like Joe Sonia, one way to keep the bottle from drying, the tube from drying out, is to squeeze out the air before you put that cover on. Can't really do that with the bottled paints. So, that's why it's important to occasionally shake those bottles in between your projects and make sure that you can keep that paint viable, because if you do shake it, it will stay for you. It will remain fresh longer. So, number 4, when you're working with your mediums in their containers that they came in, whether it's say Grumbacher medium number 1 in this little bottle, or a glass bottle, or now they have plastic bottles, or it's a can of alcohol or turpentine. Don't stick your dirty brushes into your medium containers. Instead, take and pour a little bit of that medium, whether it's the oil painting medium, Grumbacher turpentine, lacquer thinner. Some people like mineral spirits. I think they're too oily, but pour it into say a custard cup, and keep the stuff that's brand new and clean, pristine, by never putting anything into those containers. Pour what you need out first. Okay, number 5, one of the things I see being done all the time, drives me up the wall, is when people use their brushes to mix their colors. I never use my brushes to mix my colors. I use a palette knife. That's what palette knives are for. A lot of people think that they're just a great tool for applying heavy loads of paint onto a flat canvas, but they really are great for mixing paint on your palette. You can pile your paint up into one little pile, mix it very thoroughly. The ones I use are very flexible, and they're actually quite sharp because they're so thin. But I have a couple of different sizes. The smaller the palette knife is, the smaller pile of paint you can mix, which is a little more important when you're mixing oil paints, because oil stretches a lot longer, it seems, than acrylics, and unless you're using a special palette in acrylics like I'm going to be talking about next. But you don't ever want to mix your paints with your brush. You pay too much money for brushes to be doing that, and it'll also work the paint up into the ferrule. That's the metal part that squeezes onto those bristles and holds them together. The paint will get worked up into that ferrule, and then it'll soften when you're using it on a different project, and it'll taint the color of the paint, which is a totally different project. So always mix with a palette knife. Now for palettes, I use the Masterson Stay Dry, Stay Wet palette. It's got a nice small footprint. It's plastic. It's got a cover. It stores my mixed paints for weeks if necessary. It keeps it the same as the day you left it if you make sure that the sponge that's in the system remains wet and you have treated the paper by boiling it in a microwave in water for 10 minutes. It really works well. So I highly recommend you use the handy palette, stay dry, stay wet handy palette for acrylic paints. They have a larger one. It's a more rigid plastic, and I don't like it as much as the plastic in the small one, which is softer, a little more pliable. When I paint in oils, though, I use a clear glass pie plate, and then I use a second one of the same size to cover it up at night. I use custard cups for my mediums, and then I use custard cups to cover my mediums if there's any left over at the end of the day, so that it'll be fresh and not dry out overnight, evaporate. So when I'm painting, I'm going to go to number 7, and I find that one of the major keys to painting a nice soft piece is to use the right consistency of paint. The consistency I use, whether it's base coats or it's fine detail painting, is like the consistency of half and half that you would put in your coffee. Not thin as milk and not as thick as cream, but about half and half. And I will create a puddle of the color that I've already mixed. Then I'll come back with my water, or I'll come back with my medium, and I'll create a puddle so that I can go back and forth from the palette to the bird and not have to recreate the right consistency of paint again, so that it saves a lot of time and it keeps me going for a long period of time without having to keep mixing new puddles. The bigger puddle, the longer you can go. So number 8, I use a good quality paper towel, like Brawny. It doesn't have any lint. There are other brands that are a little more expensive that are lintless, but my big thing is the Select-A-Size in paper towels. I want to be able to use only half a paper towel at a time, and Brawny also comes in quartered Brawny towels. They're a little more expensive and a little bit more difficult to find, but it's really wonderful because when I'm painting, whether it's my brushes or my palette knife, I'm constantly wiping them with my brush, whether the paper towel is underneath my bird and I'm using it to touch my brush to get a little bit of the paint off of it, or I'm using it to wipe the paint off of my palette knife so that it's ready for use the next time around, or I use the paper towel for wiping the paint out of my brush before I go and rinse it in whatever it is, medium, if it's turpentine, or if it's the medium, or a combination of both, or if it's water. Why not wipe out the majority of the paint from your brushes before you go to those containers and contaminate them with even more? You can make your mediums last a lot longer and your brushes last a lot longer if you work cleanly and clean up your brushes and palette knife with a paper towel before you go to rinse them. So let's move on to number 8. I employ a Lazy Susan. Rubbermaid makes really good plastic versions. I have many of them in different sizes. These are the top ones here are 12 inches. then I have two 18 inchers, and then I have, it's hard to tell, but I have a wooden one that's 20 inches wide, used for my big pieces like loons in my clay models, and then I switch over for painting and use it for the big pieces. I find them at Goodwill. You know, you don't have to spend a lot of money. And the Rubbermaid, they're not very expensive at all. You know, $8, $10, not much. Well worth the investment. I've had all of these, you can tell, for quite some time. They're not that pretty, but they do the job. So number 10, work in a well-lit area. Whether you prefer natural light or artificial light from bulbs, which incandescent, compact, fluorescent, whatever flips your switch. I've seen enough light to see what, you just have to have enough light to see what you're doing. I like the swing arm lamps with the incandescent bulbs. I bought up a whole bunch of incandescent bulbs before they stopped manufacturing them and switched over to the compact fluorescents. But someday I might have to switch over, and hopefully by then they'll be a better quality. I just like the incandescent light better, especially for carving because they cast a shadow, where fluorescents don't really do that. Number 11, work cleanly. Keep your work area neat and organized. Have your paper towels within reach, a trash can within reach. Organize your paint tubes or bottles in an order which makes sense to you. For me, you'll see I line them on paints like the color wheel in subsequent step number 12, tip number 12. With my Deco Art Traditions, I use basically 12 colors to mix every color I need, with the exception of iridescence. So I use dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, cadmium red, Hansa yellow, titanium white, warm white, yellow oxide, burnt sienna, raw sienna, burnt umber, raw umber, and carbon black. Now you can see the way I've got these lined up. It's how I always line them up. This bottle is matte medium. I'm sorry, this is a flow medium that I don't use very often. I use it more for glazing than anything. Or is that glazing? No, that's glazing medium. That's what I use that for. So I can create any color with these 12 colors on my palette for the most part. And leaving them lined up in the color wheel like I have here. This would be, I don't have the dioxazine purple in here, but that's an important color to have. I could mix, but I use a lot of purple with loons and other birds. So when it comes to iridescence, I use the Chroma airbrush paint interference colors. There's 4 of them, and I use them in combination with the Deco Art Traditions colors on my palette because they mix really well. When I paint in oils, I use the interference powder that you see in this picture below. There's, I don't know, about 14 different colors. I got mine from Kurt's Waterfowl Corner, but you want to make sure and use it sparingly. I mix it into the oil color that I'm painting right on my palette, a little bit on my palette knife, and mix it into the color I'm working with. And then I do very thin passes with the medium when it's oils, and when it's acrylics, I do the same thing. Just several light passes are better than one heavy pass, because you also want to let it settle, let it dry. Let the oil evaporate and the turpentine evaporate from your oil projects, or let the water dry, because it'll look different. So Um, that's really important. I mean, basically, people don't understand that, and they'll put too much iridescence on, and it'll look like their bird could glow in the dark in competition. Quite common to see that in the novice division. So, number 14, I save my Whitest Whites, the highlights on my bird. I use titanium white. For the darkest colors, the darkest blacks, I like carbon black. For the shadows, highlights and shadows are my final painting steps. Splits, things like that. But save that, because you can never paint black any blacker than it already is. So and same thing with the titanium white. It's as white as it gets, and you can't paint white white, and you can't paint black black. So you need to have some contrast with those colors. So you save those for the very last, if you can do that. So Randy also asked, do I paint in oil or do I paint in acrylics, and why? Well, I paint with both, but there's different projects that they apply to for me. When I burn really finely, when I paint it in oils, I use the TK sealer. It's watery thin, it soaks into the surface of the wood, and because of this, the oils loses very little detail in the carving and the texturing and the burning, because the paint's actually penetrating into the surface of the wood, where when you're painting with acrylics, it's unavoidable to fill in your detail. And that's because you have to seal the bird from the water that's in the acrylic paint. So it's more a matter of planning for acrylic paint. When you paint with water-based acrylics, you've got to completely seal that surface of the wood so the water won't ruin the fine wood burning you spent hours on. Or even texturing, it'll make it go flat and make it go fuzzy. You don't want that water to get in there, so you have to really be diligent about sealing your acrylic birds. So it'll take several coats of sealer to seal the surface of a decorative piece for acrylics. Then you're going to have to make it so that it can accept the paint. So then you have some primer, which is generally gesso. It also helps achieve a soft matte look, having that gesso be between your sealed surface and the paint you're going to be using. And then you have to paint enough layers to achieve even coverage. Usually that's 3 to 5 thin passes just for your base coats. So with all those layers spelled out above, and it'll be in this PDF, that's 6 to 10 layers of something: sealer, gesso, and paint. And that's enough to fill in your detail. And that's not even including painting. That's just the base coats. You've got all this other painting you're going to want to do on top of your base coats. So if you haven't planned and accounted for what's going to get filled in with that paint and that sealer and that primer, you would want to do a heavier texture, a heavier burn. You'd want to make sure that when you applied all of those things, what you have left over is a beautiful texture and not a bunch of filled in work that you spent hours on and you're sick because all that detail was lost. So that's very, very important. So again, when I'm doing the fine detail, I paint in oils. When I'm doing smoothies, I paint in both oils and acrylics. It all depends upon the project and what kind of look I'm trying to achieve in a smoothie. So I will always go with oils on a finely burned decorative piece. I go into a little bit more explanation in the PDF that accompanies this video. So be sure and refer to that. So now I'm going to go to the next brave soul who asked question, Gene Bach. Can you explain how you make the tiny little feather lines on the heads? Well, when I create the individual barbs within the feather, it's important to have a plan. I've drawn a layout and I follow it. I begin at the front with the smallest feathers, and I start the first burn line at the base of the feather. As I reach the end of the feather, I end the barb by twisting the burning tip just to the right to bring the barb to a point on one side. The next burn line also started at the base of the feather, but this time the twist of the burning tip is to the left, and it closed a point on that barb. Now you have one barb. Remember not to burn too deep. Feather barbs are connected by interweaving with the barb next to it, so keep that in mind when burning. I have a video showing how to end feather barbs on YouTube, and I'm including that link to YouTube in this PDF. And then I have 46 videos, about 20 minutes long each, showing how I textured and burned a redhead drake head. It's a video series that after I finish wood burning, I go on to paint it in oils for anyone who might be interested. But here's the playlist to the 46 videos showing you how I texture and wood burned a redhead drake head to that fine detail you're asking about, Gene. So then Randy Nokes followed up with another question. What bits do I use for power carving or texturing? Well, I'm carving both tupelo and butternut wood here. And my rough out favorite tool is a 1/2 inch by 1 3/4 carbide cut-saw sleeve. It's on a 1/4 inch shank, and I use it with my Fordham. I have a medium coarse version and I have a fine grit version. Fine grit version wears out faster, of course, than the medium coarse, which keeps on going. For hearted tupelo, which is not uncommon these days, I use the extreme, very coarse cut-saws. This ball nose here is wonderful for doing the rough out work on hard tupelo and on butternut. Keep in mind though, when you're using these extreme bits, they will tear the wood below the surface a little further, which might require a little bit more cleanup, and it might take some wood that you hadn't accounted for. So they are rough, but you got to be sure to realize that they tear up the surface of the wood to get the wood out, and then you have to clean that up. So to clean that up, I use for not only bandsaw marks, the scarring that the rough out surfaces have, I use a bud-shaped carbide cross cutter. Sometimes refer to them as stump cutters. I don't, other people do. They're available from gregdorrance.com and other wood carving suppliers. They work excellent in removing the scars and keeps me from having to sand, and I'm talking about these bud-shaped cross cutters right here. That's 4 different sizes he's got. Then those are 3/32 shafts, and I also use diamond spheres of various sizes to custom fit my glass eyes, but my favorite tip is a diamond long flame, and I use that for most of my feather carving and detail work. I also have a set of 1/16 inch diamonds for carving small things like hummingbirds and other really fine details like nostril detail inside the nostril holes, lamellae on the bills, and then I also use these aluminum oxide tapered cone bits for texturing in my feather textures. I have them in 3/32 shaft and in 1/16 shaft, and the 1/16 are very difficult to find. I bought mine about 30 years ago, and they're still holding up for me. And then Randy asked one last question. Do you also use hand tools, and if so, which one? Well, the only hand tools I use are my hands. Otherwise, I'm strictly power. Anyway, that's been my Q&A for June 2021. I will make this PDF available for everybody who's interested. And then this video will be posted up to YouTube and Facebook. And I hope you've gotten your questions answered. And if not, follow up with me and I'll see if I can elaborate even more. Anyway, thanks for joining me.